I'm going to show you some techniques that you probably don't know. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to model this small, cute little icosphere planet solar system thing. Now, it doesn't matter if you don't like planets, that's absolutely fine. The objective here is to teach you about the different techniques that you can use in your own scenes, whatever those scenes may be. So to begin with, we're going to start by adding an icosphere. The reason we're using an icosphere as opposed to a UV sphere is because around the icosphere, every single side and every single angle is the same. Whereas on a UV sphere, all the points converge at the two poles. Now, we don't really want that in this particular case. We want something that is majority spherical. Now, I know this is a bit janky, but that's absolutely fine. What you can do is when you create the icosphere, you can increase the subdivisions. So in this case, we're going to increase the subdivisions to 5, so we get a lot more points to work with. So when you're in edit mode, so let's just deselect everything and then go and select random again. And in this case, we'll go to select, and we want the ratio something really, really small. So like 0.15 maybe, or 0.015. So there we go. We've got a few points that have been selected, a few faces. So now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into proportional editing. So press O on your keyboard, and you can bring up the proportional editing, and you can change this to random fall off. So what will happen now is that when you scale, you'll get a lot of random noise that's happening with the scale. Now, if you decrease the size of the fall off, we're going to get these little mountainous areas. So let's say those are all our mountains. This is quite a mountainous planet by the looks of things, but that's absolutely fine. There's no issue there. So the next thing we're going to do, and I'm only going to do this so that I can demonstrate this to you so you can sort of visualize what's going on. I can only really do this in cycles, so you don't really need to change the cycles. This is just to demonstrate it, so just bear that in mind, and I'll show you what the end shader looks like. But we'll start off with a vertical split and change this into a shader editor window. We'll need to make a new material, and we'll call this planet. So to begin with, we're going to change the output from surface to volume, and we're going to change the emission. I'm going to crank that up to white. So we've now got this kind of like fogginess that's going on inside. So in the shader window, I'm going to press Control T. This is with the add-on Node Wrangler, which is free to add on. Just go to your preferences, add-ons, enable Node Wrangler. It makes things so much easier for you. Okay, so we don't need this image texture, so we're going to press Shift and S, which will allow us to change that node. And we're going to change this to gradient texture. I'm going to change this from linear to spherical. And then what we need as well, Shift A to add a color ramp. Stick that color ramp in there. And then we're going to plug the color ramp just into the emission strength. The other thing we need to do is we need to change this from generated, from the UV to generated. No, we don't. We need to change it to object. My mistake. So now you can see there that we have this kind of sphere in the middle. And that's what we're looking for. So what I like to do, just to make things a little bit simpler for me, is I'm going to add a value input. And then from the value input, we're going to do a combine X, Y, Z. And that's going to plug into the scale. Plug each of these values into the X, Y, Z of that. And so now we can just change one value and it changes all of them. So as you can see here, by adjusting this, it changes the scale of the object. Now we've got a very kind of fuzzy edge here, which is fine. But you may want to adjust this to, so as you can see, the closer these get together, the more solid the line becomes. So what we're going to want to do is want to decrease this just enough so that it kind of cuts off the edges. So you can see what's happening here. Now what we can do is we can unplug this, change the emission back down to that, change this to surface. And all of a sudden you can see now that all of the tips are black and the rest of it's white. So what we can do is we can use this and say, okay, well, I want snow on the top of my mountains and I want everything else to be a lush green. Maybe that's a little bit too overpowering on there, a little bit maybe, a little bit desaturated. That looks kind of nice, I suppose. But then you can add like another one in. And so we can say, okay, well, this needs to be dirt. So we'll pop that dirt perhaps, crunch it down so that the gradient's not too strong. I'd say probably there. Ideally, I want to add another node in there just so that we can separate those boundaries a little bit more. So now we can see that we've got some dirt on the ground and we've got some grass, I suppose, and then we've got snow on on the tips, and you can adjust this by just moving the slider just a little bit to whatever suits you, so you don't have to have too much snow, or you can have more snow if you really want to. It's entirely up to you, of course. So now we can come back into Eevee because we don't need to have it in cycles anymore. But of course, if you want to render in cycles, then more power to you. Just Eevee's faster, and use the render engine that suits the style. So the next thing we do is we add another icosphere, and for this one, just going to make it a little bit bigger. You can probably see where this is going now. Add another material, and we will call this ocean. We change the base color to aqua blue, and then we could probably say, okay, let's displace this a little bit. We'll use a new texture. Click on this little icon here to the side to quickly jump to the textures, and we'll say maybe Musgrave. No, I don't like Musgrave. Let's say Voronoi maybe. Don't worry about these massive mountains right now because we can tone it down a little bit. We can change the strength in the modifier to bring it down to something. We only want it really tiny, a very, very subtle bump. We don't want anything too crazy. And then we can adjust the mid-level to bring it back up. There we go. So I can see that it kind of looks very green, and I'm not loving that actually. So I'm just going to bring this in a little bit. I think I liked more snow as well, so I'm going to bring that down. So there we go. We have a nice little looking planet. Right, so the next thing that we're looking at doing is let's make some moons, because this little planet looks a little bit lonely. So we'll come and make another icosphere, and let's move this on the x-axis. And we're going to do a similar kind of thing, but in this case, we're going to make sure it is in vertex select mode. Select random again, and we're going to change this to deselect, quite a high number. So maybe 0.95 maybe. Decent amount of points to work with. Do 0.0975. We don't want too many selected. Now, what we can do with all these points selected is we can press Ctrl and plus, and that will give us a load of random shape. This may even be too many, but I'm going to go with it because we don't want to press Ctrl Z too many times and make too many mistakes. It looks like I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, if you press I, it will inset these areas, and then if we press Alt and E and then extrude along face normals, we can actually bring these in and make some cute little craters. So there we go. And if you wanted to, you could go into face select mode and select some of these rings. You don't need to do all of them. Don't need to do any of them. As many or as few as you like. A couple more. So I'm just holding Shift and Alt and selecting the loop, and now we can just do Alt and E again, extrude along face normals, and then we've got the rims of the craters. Looking very moon-like. I want to add another displace modifier on this, and we're going to put that to 0.1. This is going to look pretty much the same as the ocean, so we're just going to steal that texture there, and it just gives it a little bit more of a rougher surface. We don't want it too smooth because, it's the moon. I mean, it might be smooth, I don't know. I'm no moon expert, but I think it looks better like this. I'm going to make a new material. I'm going to call this moon. I'm going to change the base color, drop that down, crank up the roughness, because we don't want no shiny moon. And there we go, we have a moon. But how do we get it rotating? So you're probably aware of techniques such as, you know not to kind of rotate it from a point-to-point basis because it will just interpolate between those 2 points on a linear fashion. So you might think, okay, well, yeah, I will add in a null object and I'll parent the null. So it says sphere, blah, blah, blah. Right, so we parent that, Control P object, right? So you can animate this if you want. And it goes around in a circle, which is absolutely fine, right? But what if you wanted it to go in an ellipse? How do you get it to go in an ellipse? Still delete that. Let me show you. So what you want to do is you want to just keyframe the location. And then let's make us another window. Let's split this in half. And then pressing Shift and F6, it'll take you to the graph editor. Now come over to modifiers. And let's just bring up this so we can see where we're at. Let's just make this a little bit more round. So I'm -3 and Y0. This is just so that we can keep things all nice and neat. Keyframe those again. Right, so what we're going to do is twirl down the individual properties, and we don't need the Z location, so let's just get rid of that. Now, what you want to do is click on, for example, the X location, come over to modifiers. You might need to press N to open the tools, and then built-in function. What we're going to do is we're going to say amplitude is 3, phase multiplier is 0.05 perhaps. Now the Y location, we're going to do the same built-in function, but we're going to change this to cosine, and we're going to put the amplitude to 3, 0.05. Now what we'll see here, now watch this, right? So it's going around in a circle. Okay, so I've recreated the functionality of rotating that object. So we're just going round and round and round. But what we can do now is if we want this to go into an ellipse, we can change either the X or Y, and we can say, maybe make that 4.5. Now what you can see here is it's traveling in an elliptical shape. Just going to increase the path, the keyframes, just so that you can see. So yeah, look, you can see it's just running round and round in an ellipse, which is really cool. That's something you couldn't achieve just by, not easily at least, by keyframing. You could maybe like manually do it or bake it or something, or follow a curve perhaps. And that's great. You know, you can use curves. I suppose you could make a curve, have it follow a curve, but I think this one's a lot simpler. It makes things a lot more clutter free, I suppose. And you can just adjust the size, super simple. You don't need to mess around with points. You don't need to mess around with smoothing. This is as theoretically precise as you could possibly want it. And all you need to do is change the amplitude and it will change the arc. Small, big, whatever, right? Leave that on maybe 3.5 just to give it a little bit of a loop. Now, let's stop that and I'm just going to disable the modifiers for the minute just so that we can work on something else. Right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a couple of empties. So we're going to say sphere. I don't want it there. Let's put the cursor there. I'm going to add a sphere. I'm going to make it big and let's rename this to influence. And then we're going to add another empty. Bigger. We're going to call this magnitude. So now with both of these, let's parent them to the moon. And also while we're thinking about the moon, let's just come over to the object constraint and we're going to track this. It's important that we track it. I'm going to track it towards the ocean. I'll just keep it from swizzling around. I'm just going to change that to X and that to Z, and that should be the same orientation as it was. It is. That's great. So now wherever this moon is, those empties will follow, and also the moon will point towards the planet. And that's pretty much how moons work anyway, or that's how our moon works, kind of. It's always facing the Earth. So what we need to do is we need to take both of these and we need to grab them on the x-axis and shift them a little bit closer to Earth. Now we're going to have to twiddle around with these a little bit. If you watch, it's always pointing towards the Earth, and that's kind of important that these empty objects are facing, right? So we select the ocean and we come over to the modifiers, and what we want is we want this warp modifier added on there, and we do object from, and we're going to say influence object to magnitude, and we're going to change the fall off. We can change the curve to a sphere, and we're going to change this to maybe 1.5. Now the way this works is that the closer the object of influence is to the, you see how it's like kind of bulging out there? Adjust this on the x-axis. It kind of like stretches towards that object. So what we can do is we can just take all three of these and press / on your keyboard, and it will isolate everything. This is called local mode, and we can just move it around. We don't want too much to be influenced, but we want it to kind of look nice. You see that fall off? It's kind of harsh. So you can do it smooth if you want to. It depends on what look you're going for. Sphere gives you a little bit more of a chunk, I suppose. Maybe make it like smooth, but make it quite large. Grab that one. Actually, yeah, I think that's deforming pretty cool. Actually, I like that. So let's just come out of local mode so we can see it in relation to the planet there. So we should probably exaggerate this a little bit. So there we go. Right, so now when we press play, watch, nothing happens. Disabled the modifiers. When we press play after we've enabled the modifiers, we can see here that the gravitational pull, pulling the ocean towards the moon. Now, I don't want any space nerds telling me that it doesn't work like this, because I know it doesn't work like this. I know that the other side should be bulging. And you could probably achieve that if you really wanted to by duplicating these at the opposite side of the planet and just adding another modifier on. So that you could achieve that, but I don't want to. I want it to look like this. It's like a super magnet of water. Okay, so there we go. Next thing we should do, we should probably put this into a little universe. So again, we're going to create icosphere, and we're going to undo that, and we are going to Shift C to put it back at the center. Icosphere. I'm going to scale this. We're going to say, we don't need as many subdivisions, so we can probably put that back to 2 subdivisions, but we'll say the radius is 10. Actually, I'll leave it at 4 subdivisions and change that to 20, I think. Okay, so create a material and we'll call this space. And what we want to do is change the base color. Let's change it black for a minute. But the important thing that we're doing is you want to change backface culling off, go into edit mode, press Alt and N, and then flip. And now we can actually see through the sphere, but we can still see the material on the inside. Press W to shade it smooth. And now let's bring up shader editor window. The shortcut for that is Shift and F3. So first things first, let's get rid of this roughness. Sorry, let's add the roughness and remove the speck. Now pressing Control and T, we'll add some mapping nodes, and we need to Shift S, change this texture to noise texture. And what we're going to do is we are going to take a converter and color ramp into that and change it from color to FAC. We bring this down, get a little bit more contrast, change the scale to maybe just say like 500 for example. Curious, would it look better as I want to change to white noise? There we go. Okay, so what we can do with the color ramp is we can flip it over, crank it right. Okay, I preferred it on noise actually with the detail scale at 500. If you just use this to crank it right down, because we don't want things too extreme in our face, we can probably put the value of these up to maybe like 10 just to give them that little bit of glow. So that'll give them a little bit of a twinkle. And then we can also turn on bloom in the settings. So I think we should probably add a camera back in. So right now this will probably look a bit grim. Yeah, so let's... The next thing we want to do really is we need to add a light source. So we could probably use a point light or an area light. I think maybe an area light in this case, pointing straight at the planet. Okay, this sphere is a bit of a pain in the bum. So what we're going to do is just rename that universe. Now if you come up to this filter drop down here, you can add this restriction toggle. Tap on that one, and then we can now untick that. So we can no longer select the universe. We've no need to select the universe anymore, but it's nice to see. So we can get rid of that. Also, if you really wanted to as well, you can get rid of this floor grid. And now it really looks like it's in space. Lost my area light. There we go. Right, back to where we were at. So we can actually point this, grabbing this little yellow dot, we can point that at, that's really annoying. Right, we're going to point that at the planet. So we shouldn't have any more irritations with that now. And what we can do is we can increase the size like massive, because we can maybe make that 10, for example. And then we're just going to crank up some numbers here, 10,000, 100,000 maybe. 10 on the scene lights and scene world. So that's pretty bright. So we can do maybe 50,000, nope, 10,000. So that's looking a little bit more reasonable, I'd say. It's got a little bit of a bloom going on, but not too much. You can crank this down, you know, if you feel it's too much. So you can maybe 5,000, but 7,500. I like the glow personally. I like the glow. Right, so we now have the moon rotating around. Now I think that the moon's a little bit close actually. So we're going to do Shift F6, go into the editor. We're going to change the amplitude. So we'll change this to 4, this one to 3.5. This gives it a little bit of a nudge out of the way. There we go. I think that looks absolute banking. I'm just going to come out of shaded mode for the time being, and I'm going to hide some of these things because what I want to show you is one last thing, unless I think of something else. But for the minute, what I want to do is I want to add in another empty, and I want to call this, it is a circle. I'm going to scale it up a little bit. So we'll say scale 3, and then rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. And let's look at it from the top view. So when we remind ourselves of these, we've got 3 on the x and 4 on the y. We can scale that on the, in fact we can change this directly in the editor, can't we? And say, why is it not doing that? I'm changing the wrong value. That's why. Right, so it's 4 on the y and it is 3.5 on the x, and we have 3.5. So that should match the orbit. It does, which is cool. So that's just a little something to help you visualize things, but also we do need to have this empty, because what we can do is we can take this planet and the empty, we can parent the planet to the empty. So now if, say for example, we wanted to duplicate this, so I'm not going to duplicate the modifiers or anything, I'm just going to duplicate the planet, I'm just going to duplicate the empty. So if we do Shift D, and now we can rotate it around, and these two planets, they will follow in opposite orbits, which is fine. And what we probably need to do with the second planet is we can probably say we can make this 7 on the X, for example, and we'll say 0.5 on the Y just to keep that slight ellipse, and say you need to change that before you change that. Actually, let's make this a little bit bigger. Let's call it 8. And we said 12 on this one, for example. So there we go. Passing by. And let's make it a little bit slower as well. 0.01, 0.01. And the other thing we can do is we can supersize this as well. I'm going to have this as like a supermoon that's traveling like really slowly. Oh, they just miss each other. So yeah, there we go. Now if we go back into our rendered mode and load up our universe again. So there we go, we've got a nice little scene there where everything's rotating around. And what you can do as well is you can put little satellites in there. You can maybe make a sun, so we cut down, sun. So in Eevee this won't actually change the emission, but we can make it pretty sun-like. Probably let's add a material to that, so we can say add color mix RGB to input. Sometimes I find that doing it this way by adding 2 RGBs and mixing them is better than duplicating the shader. It just makes things a little bit neater. And pump those into there. We're going to copy Control C, Control V, drag that around and make that a little bit warmer. Plug that into the emission. And now all we need to do is create a lovely texture, and we'll say Voronoi. I like Voronoi. Distant there. Control T to add mapping. And we've got some kind of like hotspots. You see, we can, if we needed to, we can add a converter and add a color RAM there. We can add a bit more contrast depending on what you're looking for. I think that it's fine like that, just on the default settings, quite frankly. Can change. But yeah, it's put that into the universe. Now you can see there that this is in front of the, because ideally what you do is position this with the sun. So move that with selected to cursor. Now you can see it's glowing on there. What we want to do is in the material properties, we need to change the shadow mode. It'll pass straight through the sun. So I think in this particular instance, due to using the area light, it's not doing us any favors, because as you can see, it's projecting onto the sun itself, and we don't want that. So it's not going to make a lot of difference in this particular case, but we're going to change this to a point light to crank it up a little bit. But yeah, there we go. So because of not having the shadows on there, it's passing straight through, so it's not like illuminating the sun itself. It's passing through it, which I think is probably pretty cool. Yeah, so there you go. Nice little planet scene. Say you could add some satellites, you can add little bits and pieces like flags on the moon and whatnot. But yeah, there's a few techniques in there which I think everybody should know. So if you found these useful, if you didn't know about some of these techniques, then give me a thumbs up if you learned something. And if you want more content in the future from me, if you like my teaching style, then hit that subscribe button, and YouTube will push you my content when it thinks it is appropriate for you, when it knows you're looking for Blender tutorials and whatnot. So yeah, hopefully I will see you in the next one. Drop me a comment if you're new here. And yeah, have fun blendering.